Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ag Innovation News Podcast, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. Guests on the Ag Innovation News Podcast will shed light on innovations in value-added ag, highlight important voices and work that's being done throughout the Minnesota ag sector, and educate the public about resources and organizations that support Minnesota agriculture. Today, we welcome to the podcast Charlie Vogel, Chief Executive Officer of Minnesota Wheat. Charlie, welcome to the podcast. Let's get some background on you, first of all, because you've taken an interesting route to Minnesota Wheat. Everything from the classroom to leading other adventures around agriculture. So give us a little bit of a background on the steps that you took to get to the Minnesota Wheat job.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. It has been a long journey that's brought me here, but it's been a good one, all in ag. I grew up on a farm in the southern Boise Valley in Idaho. Went to college, University of Idaho, and got my degree in ag education, and had the opportunity to teach high school ag and be an FFA advisor for 7 years in Colorado. Following that experience, I went to work for Nichols Tillage Tools, running their robotic and welding department. Then moved on to an agronomy location manager for CHS in Colorado, and later on to an independent co-op, Can-Do Farmers Grain and Oil in Can-Do, North Dakota, to be their agronomy manager and later general manager. With North Central Co-op, we led a merger effort about 5 years ago to form Legacy Cooperative. And following that successful merger, Minnesota Wheat called and offered this opportunity to be the executive director, and that's a short synopsis of the past 20 years.
And Charlie, tell me a little bit about what intrigued you about the job.
What really intrigued me about the Minnesota Wheat offer is it is a unique blend of what I liked about teaching, working with growers, university professionals in the industry to disseminate information and problem solve, but was also a blend of private sector with agronomy, financials. It was a meld of all those things together, the education side, the business management side, but still at that core, it was working with growers to help us feed the world.
Charlie, when I introduced you, I called you the Chief Executive Officer of Minnesota Wheat. You have already used the term Executive Director at some point. Maybe for our listeners today, a little explanation about the organization or organizations that you're actually working for.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Minnesota Wheat's an informal name of two organizations. The Minnesota Wheat Growers Council is who actually employs me. That's who I'm the executive director of. And they are the checkoff for wheat in Minnesota. Their two major initiatives are promotion. So we work with U.S. wheat and domestic millers and bakers to promote the wheat growing here in Minnesota. And the other bug bucket is research, where we work on with the University of Minnesota, Dr. Jim Anderson, on developing wheat varieties, working with individual researchers doing on-farm research, and working with AURI on some research that I'm sure we'll get into later. The other organization is the Minnesota Association of Wheat Growers, or MAWG, and they are membership driven. That is where we get into working in St. Paul and Washington, D.C., to encourage farm policy that's advantageous to our wheat growers.
So I'm guessing the two organizations have different business models. Do they have different missions as well?
The missions are similar but different. The objective's the same. They're both looking at how can we improve Minnesota and help Minnesota wheat farmers be more productive, be more sustainable, both economically and environmentally, and have overall success at feeding the world. How we go about those two missions are slightly different. The council goes through it through promotion and research, and then the Growers Association's doing it through working with our agencies and politicians on farm policy.
And I want to talk about that mission, the piece that's research and promotion a little bit, just because AURI, of course, spends a lot of time talking about value added and use of commodities, and a little bit of work that Minnesota Wheat is doing on value added. What kind of roads are you going down in that degree?
Traditionally, our research has very much been looking at very farmer facing. So looking at wheat breeding, agronomic practices, whether that through our on-farm research network, whether that be nitrogen trials to improve water quality, or seeding rates to improve, get the most economical yield with the lowest seed cost. Those type initiatives are our traditional research. Over about 3-4 years ago, we had the opportunity to look at some research that is more consumer or industry facing with a wheat digestibility study and research program that we partnered with AURI on and MDA, Minnesota Department of Agriculture, on looking at wheat digestibility and addressing this problem of the market's telling us that people have, whether that's celiac or gluten intolerances, or we are consuming half the wheat domestically that we did 100 years ago. So looking at the causes of that and what can be done to hopefully reverse that trend.
Charlie, I want to stay there for just a second because I'm curious, and I think some of our listeners will be curious what that research found. If it was genetics that have changed that much from 100 years ago, or what has changed the digestibility of wheat, if anything?
Our hypothesis going into it was what you led with. Was it genetics? Was as we have successfully bred wheat varieties over the last 100 years to be more drought resistant, more disease resistance, more drought tolerant. The question was, had we inadvertently also increased gluten strength, resulting in harder to digest wheat? So that was the hypothesis we went into, and we thoroughly disproved that hypothesis. We planted varieties, we did trials on varieties from ancient grains, so grains over 100 years ago, heritage varieties, and then also tested modern varieties. And we looked at FODMAPs and ATIs, and those are big long acronyms for the proteins and what's hard to digest in wheat. We ran panels on them, and it was a scatter plot when we tried to look for trends, meaning that there was no direct correlation between any of the varieties. Some of the ancient grains, some of the heritage wheats, and some of the modern wheats were high, low, and in the middle. So there was no correlation. Our breeding practices had not caused the problem. But through that, what we did identify were two major things. One, there are varieties that we currently have that are easier to digest, meaning lower in FODMAPs and ATIs, than other varieties. And that by using fermentation to process it, those numbers, regardless of the variety, came down substantially. So those were two big finds that we're continuing to look at today and continue this research, looking to see if Dr. Jim Anderson's working at the University of Minnesota on the breeding side to see if we can intentionally select for traits that are easier to digest. And then we are also looking at the other aspect of that on with Dr. Georgia Knorr at the University of Minnesota. Can we change the way modern wheat is baked to improve digestibility?
If I'm hearing you right, then, Charlie, I'm hearing that it's not only genetics, or it could be partially genetics, but processing of that wheat is also a piece of the puzzle.
We do believe it's a piece of the puzzle. The processing is, if you think back to 50 years ago or more, when wheat consumption was way higher than it is today, the way we made bread is every grocery store had their own bakery. It proved they needed that bread in-house. It proofed for 4 hours to overnight, and then it was baked. Well, now as we've gone to more regionalized bakeries and millers, the volume became higher and the speed went up. So now when they mill, it doesn't have the opportunity to ferment as long or rise. So we've got proofing chambers, we've got everything to speed that up and make it as efficient as possible so the consumer can have a nutritious quality product at the most affordable price. But it appears that as we've done that, by shortening that fermentation process, really what was happening is the bugs were helping digest the gluten for us. With those shorter fermentation processes, instead of having those symbiotic organisms help digest it through the fermentation process, now our bodies have to do that all on their own. And we're thinking that that could be part of why there's an increase in these gluten sensitivities. We need to get back to having some of those microorganisms help us out.
And that takes us to what we call at EURI the Back When Foods Project. Is that right?
It is, yes. That is where that comes in, and that's all part of this research. Back When Foods, Brian LaPlante has been part of this research project since I started on it 3 years ago. he's been the one that has been baking the products and testing them, and just a wealth of research capabilities.
Any indication yet what he's uncovering?
Yeah, that's really on the processing. Him and George Honor have worked hand in hand on where he would grow and bake the bread. George is the lab, or Dr. Honor is the lab at the University of Minnesota that would analyze that and come up with these research findings that show if we can get to the point where we're fermenting or letting dough rise for 4 hours, lengthen that to at least 4 hours, there is substantial reduction in the FODMAPs and ATIs, or the hard things to digest, in wheat. And that should make it easier to digest, more palatable, and get back to that opportunity for more people to enjoy breads and pastas.
And of course, when we talk about back when foods, we talk about sourdough bread. And for people who aren't aware of back when foods, that's what it basically is. Isn't that right, Charlie?
It is. And when I say fermentation, sourdough is a type of fermentation with a starter culture, and that's what Brian's very involved with sourdough and that process. But fermentation, the advantage is that's one route we can gain this advantage, and we can gain the most advantage by doing sourdough. But there's also, by extending that fermentation process of allowing dough to rise, just in the non sourdoughs, there's opportunity there as well. So there's opportunity in the entire bread and pasta lines.
And that leads me to the question about projects in the pipeline right now that might be value added for Minnesota wheat. Is there anything in particular that you can share with our listeners about things that you're working on at the present time?
We're continuing to work on this project. We've reached out to other associations in other states. Idaho has agreed. The Idaho Wheat Commission is going to be partnering on this to help us keep cracking at this nut. And I'm really encouraged. This is such an opportunity. People enjoy bread and pasta. If we can crack this nut on why it's causing them issues and GI discomfort to where they can enjoy it again, it's healthy, it's tasty, it's palatable, it's so many traditional dishes that to drive domestic market share, there is such opportunity here. We're going to keep driving at this point and figuring it out and seeing how we can get it hopefully more mainstreamed and so more people can enjoy it.
We're talking today with Charlie Vogel. Charlie is the Chief Executive Officer of Minnesota Wheat, and talking about the business of Minnesota Wheat as well as some of the value-added programs and projects that they are involved in. Charlie, I want to, coming off your last comment, I want to turn to worldwide wheat because I'm reading reports where grains in some countries are in short supply, but the world in general is looking at rice and wheat as a source for protein and a food supply. And Minnesota Wheat has to be aware of that. And what are you doing on the worldwide perspective when you talk about wheat production?
We're heavily involved with U.S. Wheat Associates on the promotional side and educational side, working with folks on the ground. We're in multiple countries, working with them on how to most effectively and efficiently utilize U.S. wheat in their products. We're also working with government agencies, politicians. This is a real moving target where a lot of things mid-February, the whole world changed on the commodity aspect with the Russian-Ukraine situation. We're learning it as we go, but there's a lot of worry and opportunity both in the same breath for Minnesota wheat producers to produce one of the number one calorie consumed in the world that's become very top of mind here of late.
And that has to be really the challenge is oftentimes the consumer might, or the farmer even, might not think much beyond the line fence or the horizon, but there can be a little ripple in the world and that can change things for everybody.
It's dramatically changed everything. That little ripple has made some pretty good waves, whether that be in you look at the volatility in commodity prices, both on the wheat side that the farmer is selling, but just on the supply chain, the difficulty on getting parts, the price of fertilizer, the logistics in getting fertilizer. Those ripple effects have really caused agriculture is so integral or intimately entwined with the energy sector, with other sectors that we're not an island. So When things like when major events like this happen, that's why we see the volatility and uncertainty in the markets this year.
And of course, many of your growers grow other crops as well. So, my last two questions for you today, Charlie, we're going to start with Minnesota ag in general and have you get out your crystal ball. And then we'll talk about Minnesota wheat to kind of wrap things up. But Minnesota ag in general, what are you hearing? What are you seeing for the future?
I'm very optimistic for agricultural in general. With the world events going on, ag and food security has become top of mind. The pandemic was a kind of an opening salvo to that, where people really started looking and evaluating diets and wanting to have, there's going to be continued drive and desire for sustainability and consumers, domestic consumers, knowing where their food comes from and the story behind that food. Minnesota Ag's in a great position to be able to tell that story. And the more focus that goes on how food is raised, education and knowledge, it's going to lower that urban rural divide as we have those conversations and really look at the commonalities. We all need calories, we all need to eat, and the more we can build those relationships with the end consumer and the producer, the better those outcomes are going to be, and the more problems we can solve as they come up.
And if we focus that a little bit more or narrow it down, let's talk about Minnesota wheat a little bit and what you see in their future.
Minnesota wheat, on the same theme. If you look across the U.S. over the past 50 years, acres have reduced. The trend's been down. It's stabilized, but it's been down. And I think for Minnesota wheat, wheat is still the number one calorie consumed in the world. It has become top of mind, very much so, as I was alluding to on the global aspect. But wheat is an important crop. And as we become more focused on sustainability and crop rotations are looked at more, and soil health, and how can we incorporate cover crops and all these other practices that are being talked about on the ag policy front, wheat is a really good gateway into that world. It allows the growers to have diversification of labor. Wheat goes in, it's planted at a different time, it's harvested at a different time. It's the first to come off, so it allows cover crops to go in easier. People forget how far north we are and how short our growing season truly is up here. A very key focus of our on-farm research this year is working with growers and doing cover crop trials. We cooperate with soybeans and corn and the other commodities to see how it fits in the rotation. I don't have any farmers that grow just wheat. Those days, it's part of the rotation and cycle. So looking at the whole farm aspect of it. How can wheat help farmers in Minnesota be as profitable and sustainable as possible? We're making great progress on that. We've got a good story to tell, and Minnesota wheat producers are doing an excellent job.
If someone listening today, Charlie, would like more information about the work you do through Minnesota Wheat or other information about the Minnesota Wheat programs, where can they get that information?
The easiest place would be our website, which is mnwheat.org, and that'll take you to a landing page of Minnesota wheat, and then you can choose whether to go to the Minnesota Association of Wheat Growers or into the checkoff side on the council side. So the mnwheat.org will take you to both organizations.
Charlie Vogel, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Dan. I greatly appreciate the opportunity.
We've been visiting today with Charlie Vogel. Charlie is the Chief Executive Officer of Minnesota Wheat. We want to thank Charlie, and we want to thank you for joining us today and listening to the Ag Innovation News Podcast, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. To learn more about other AURI work, you can visit us at auri.org.